Ease. You sure you're in the right section, buddy? The words hit the first-class cabin like a lit match dropped in dry grass. Ease. Every head turned. A man in a leather vest covered in patches stood perfectly still in the aisle, his boarding pass in hand, eyes forward. The Hells Angels rocker across his back caught the light. Ease. Someone laughed. A phone went up, and the man they were laughing at, the man they wanted off their plane, was the only reason every single one of them would be alive before the day was over. Ease. If this story already has you gripping your seat, ease, you're in the right place. Subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. Ease. I want to see how far this story travels. The first-class boarding door opened at 6:47 in the morning. Ease. And the man who walked through it did not belong there. Ease. That was the first thought of nearly every person already seated in the forward cabin of Flight 719. Ease, Phoenix to Seattle on a Tuesday in late July, not because of anything the man said. Ease. Not because of anything he did, but because of what he wore. Ease. And what was written across his back, and the particular way he moved through a space designed for people who wore pressed linen and carried monogrammed luggage like he didn't need the space to accept him. Ease. Because he had already accepted himself a long time ago. Ease. His name was Garrett Callahan. He was 52 years old. Ease. Built like someone who had spent decades doing things that required physical discipline without ever once thinking about going to a gym. Ease. His hair was silver blonde, longer than it should have been by most conventional standards. Ease, pulled back with a simple black band. His jaw carried 3 days of salt and pepper growth. Ease. His hands, when he reached up to adjust his carry-on bag in the overhead compartment, Ease, showed the knuckles of someone who had worked with those hands for a very long time. Ease. The leather vest was the thing people noticed first. Ease, because it was impossible not to notice. Worn black leather. Ease. Soft from years of use, the kind of softness that doesn't come from a boutique store, but from decades of weather and road and living. Ease. Across the back, in the bold red and white lettering that certain people in certain parts of the country recognized immediately, Hells Angels. Ease. The bottom rocker read Arizona. The patches on the front were smaller. Ease. More personal, a constellation of meanings that only people inside that world fully understood. Ease. He sat down in seat 4B. He placed his bag under the seat in front of him. Ease. He looked out the window. That was it. That was all he did. Ease. But the cabin, which had been quietly humming with the particular white noise of first-class pre-departure conversation laptop keyboards, Ease, soft phone calls, the clink of ice and drinks already poured, went strangely. Ease, noticeably quiet for about 4 full seconds. And then it started. Ease, in seat 3A, a man named Nathan Caldwell leaned toward the woman seated beside him. Ease. Nathan was 44 years old and had made his money in commercial real estate development. Ease, which had given him a very particular kind of confidence, the kind built entirely on the assumption that the world was organized by financial hierarchy, and that his position near the top of that hierarchy was both permanent and morally correct. Ease. He was wearing a sport coat that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Ease. His watch was Swiss, his shoes were Italian. His contempt, Ease, when he deployed it, was effortless. They really let anyone into first class these days, he murmured, not particularly quietly. The woman beside him, Sandra Whitmore, Ease, a corporate attorney from Scottsdale, pressed her lips together and said nothing. Ease, though she did glance once at Garrett and then immediately back at her tablet. Ease. In seat 5, Ease, a man named Doug Pierce, Ease, who sold medical equipment and had been upgraded from business class. Ease pulled out his phone and angled the camera with practiced casualness. Ease. He wasn't the first person to do it. He wasn't the last. Ease. Across the aisle in 4A, a woman named Carla Jenkins, Ease, traveling alone on her way to visit her daughter, watched all of this happening and felt something uncomfortable settle in her chest. Ease. She was 61 years old, recently retired from 32 years as a high school English teacher in Tucson. Ease. And she had spent most of those years trying to teach teenagers about the difference between a person's surface and their substance. Ease. Watching the adults around her behave like the worst version of the students she remembered was not exactly what she had hoped for on a Tuesday morning. Ease. Garrett did not react to any of it. The flight attendant who came to take his drink order was a woman named Emily Parker. Ease. She was 38, had worked commercial aviation for 12 years after a brief earlier career that had taken her to some complicated places. Ease. And she carried herself with the particular competence of someone who had learned to read a room quickly and accurately. Ease. She looked at Garrett and asked what he'd like. He looked up at her and said, "Just water." "Thank you." The thank you was genuine. Ease. Not performative. Not the slightly overemphasized thank you that people sometimes deploy to signal their own niceness. Ease. Just two words that meant exactly what they said. Emily noticed. Ease. 12 years in the air taught you things about people that no psychology class could replicate. Ease. She noticed the water request. She noticed the absence of any territorial spreading into the empty seat beside him. Ease. She noticed that his eyes, when they weren't looking out the window, Ease moved in a particular pattern, checking the exit rows. Ease. Checking the overhead indicators, checking the crew positions in the reflexive, Ease. Unconscious way of someone for whom situational awareness was not a skill, but a deeply grooved habit. Ease. She brought him his water. He thanked her again. She moved on. Ease. Nathan Caldwell had not ordered water. He had ordered a Bloody Mary at 6:50 in the morning, which was his right, and he was working on it now while conducting a quiet, one-sided performance for the people around him. The audience he had assembled in his mind was sympathetic. The reviews he imagined receiving were excellent. "I mean, I've got nothing against motorcycles," he was saying to Sandra, who was clearly trying to read her tablet. "My cousin had a Harley. But there's a difference between riding a bike and, I don't know, advertising a criminal organization on a commercial flight." Sandra said. "I'm just saying. My kids fly this route. My wife flies this route. You'd think there'd be some kind of..." Nathan. Sandra put down her tablet. He's sitting right there. "I know he's sitting right there. He can hear you." Nathan glanced at the back of Garrett's head and then looked away. "Good," he said, with less confidence than the word was meant to carry. Garrett continued to look out the window. The aircraft pushed back from the gate at 7:02. What nobody in that cabin knew, what nobody could have known from looking at him, was that the last time Garrett Callahan had been aboard an aircraft at this hour, he had been in the left seat of an F-16 Fighting Falcon, climbing out of a base in a country whose name he still couldn't fully discuss, on his way to a target that didn't officially exist. That had been 17 years ago. 17 years ago. And it lived in his body the way all significant things eventually live in the body, not as memory exactly, but as something more structural, a kind of knowing that sat in the muscles and the joints and the inner ear. The way a pianist's hands remember a sonata, even when the pianist's conscious mind has moved on to other things. He had joined the United States Air Force at 22, fresh out of the University of Arizona on an ROTC scholarship, with a degree in aerospace engineering and a resting heart rate that his flight surgeon had once described as disturbingly low. He had gone through pilot training at Laughlin Air Force Base in Del Rio, Texas, had been selected for fighters, had spent years becoming very good at something that very few people were equipped to become good at, and had eventually accumulated more than 3,000 hours in high-performance military aircraft, including multiple combat deployments. The details of what he had done in those deployments were not fully public. The medals he had been awarded were, 3 of them were the kind that didn't get a lot of television coverage, because the situations that earned them were the kind that didn't get a lot of television coverage, but within certain communities' military aviation circles, veterans networks, specific corners of the internet where people who had been there talked to each other, his name was known. After he left the Air Force in his late 30s, he had done what many combat veterans do. He had tried, with genuine effort and real determination, to find a way to live in a world that didn't feel like it needed him in the same way. He had tried corporate consulting work, advising aerospace companies on safety protocols. He had been competent at it. He had been miserable. He had tried living in Phoenix, buying a house in a quiet suburb, learning to care about things like lawn maintenance and neighborhood associations. He had managed approximately 8 months of that before the silence became a weight he couldn't carry. He had tried, for a period that he did not speak about, some things that had not been good for him. That period had lasted about 2 years and had cost him things he still grieved. Ease. And then, through a chain of events that had begun with a broken-down truck on the side of Route 60 and a group of men on motorcycles who had stopped without being asked. Ease. He had found the Hells Angels. People heard that name and they filled in the blanks with whatever the movies had given them. Ease. Garrett understood that. He had filled in the same blanks before he knew better. Ease. What he had actually found was a community of men who understood loyalty in the specific, costly way that only people who had tested it under pressure could understand. Ease. Men who showed up. Men who kept their word. Men who had their own complicated histories with the civilian world's expectations, and who had decided collectively that they would build something that worked on their own terms. Ease. He had not joined because he agreed with every person there, or every decision ever made, or every element of the mythology. Ease. He had joined because when his truck broke down on Route 60 at 2 in the morning, 7 men had stopped. Ease, and one of them had said, Ease, without ceremony. Ease. What do you need that question? That simple question. Ease. He had not heard it in years. He said yes. Now he was on flight 719 because his daughter, Lillian, had opened a medical clinic in Seattle 3 months ago, and she had left him a voicemail last week that said, among other things, Dad, I know things have been complicated, but I'd really like to see you. If you want to come up, the room is yours. He had rewritten the letter in his jacket pocket 4 times. The first draft had been 2 pages long and had covered too much ground too quickly. The second had been half a page and had said almost nothing. The third had tried to be practical logistics, plans, dates. The fourth, which was the one currently folded in his inside pocket, was 1 page, written by hand because typing it had felt wrong. And it said the things it needed to say in the plainest language he could manage. He had not sent it in advance. He wanted to give it to her in person. He wanted to watch her read it, not to see her reaction. But because he felt that the act of handing someone a letter you had worked that hard to write was itself part of the meaning. He thought about this as the aircraft climbed. He felt the engines at the usual angles. He heard the landing gear retract with the usual mechanical chunk. He noticed, in the way he always noticed, the way the fuselage flexed slightly in the first minutes of climb. The living, breathing quality of a large aircraft under load. The way it spoke to people who knew how to listen. Nathan Caldwell had unbuckled his seatbelt about 30 seconds after the seatbelt sign turned off and was now standing in the aisle, stretching, because he was a man who believed his comfort was the primary organizing principle of his immediate environment. On his way back from the forward lavatory, he stopped at Garrett's row. Listen, Nathan said. With the tone of someone opening a negotiation they fully expected to win. I don't want any trouble. Garrett looked up from the window. Good, Garrett said. Me neither. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page here. About what? Nathan gestured vaguely at the vest. At the patches. At Garrett in general. About what this is. About where we are. This is a professional environment. Garrett looked at him for a moment with an expression that was entirely neutral. Not hostile, not amused, not performing patience, just looking. I bought a ticket, Garrett said. I'm sitting in the seat on the ticket. That's where we are. Nathan's jaw tightened. I'm not trying to start something. I know, Garrett said. You're trying to finish something that I never started. There's a difference. He turned back to the window. Nathan stood in the aisle for a moment that stretched about 3 beats too long. And then he went back to his seat. In 4A, Carla Jenkins looked at the back of Garrett's head and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. A specific kind of respect. The quiet, expensive kind that comes from watching someone who has learned not to waste words. Emily Parker had been watching from the galley. She had seen the exchange. And something had clicked in the back of her mind. Like a piece of a puzzle that had been sitting face down on the table for a while. She couldn't name it yet. It was more of a feeling than a thought, the specific feeling of having seen something before in a different form. A shape she recognized. She went back to her service work and let it sit. The aircraft leveled off at 37,000 feet over northern Arizona. The sun was coming up hard to the east, orange and flat and absolute. Ease, burning through the scratched oval windows and laying light across the cabin in the particular horizontal way that early morning high-altitude light does, making everything look simultaneously vivid and slightly unreal. Ease. Doug Pierce had posted his phone video to 2 separate social media platforms with the caption, Ease. Wild morning on flight 719. Wonder which club he represents, lol. He had 17 responses in the first 4 minutes. Ease. Most of them laughing emojis, 2 of them people asking for more information, ease, and 1 of them a single question mark from someone who clearly had better things to do, ease. He did not think about the fact that the man in the video was sitting 20 feet away and had ears that worked, ease. Garrett knew the video was happening. He had known when it started, ease. He had learned a long time ago, ease, the particular social physics of a room when someone is recording you without your consent, the angle of the device, ease. The elaborate casualness, the way a person's breathing changes when they're trying to appear not to be doing what they're doing, ease. He had been in rooms where the stakes of that kind of surveillance were considerably higher than a social media post, ease. He did not give Doug Pierce the reaction that would have made the video interesting, ease. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and took out the letter, ease. Not to read it, just to hold it. He did that, sometimes held the letter in his hands without opening it, ease, as if the weight of it and the slight give of the paper under his fingers could tell him something he hadn't yet figured out how to ask himself, ease. Lillian was 31 years old. She had her mother's eyes and his stubbornness and a medical degree from Johns Hopkins that she had earned with a ferocity that still made him catch his breath when he thought about it, ease. She had built her clinic in a neighborhood of Seattle that needed it badly, ease. The kind of neighborhood that other medical professionals drove past on their way to somewhere easier, ease. And she had done it with almost no financial support from anyone but herself and 2 of her colleagues from residency, ease. He was so profoundly proud of her that he could not speak about it without something happening to his voice, ease. That was part of the reason for the letter. A flight attendant from the rear galley came forward to speak to Emily, ease. They exchanged a few words in the lowered, careful register that experienced crew used when they didn't want passengers to read their faces, ease. Garrett watched this in his peripheral vision. His eyes stayed on the window, ease. His attention was entirely on that galley. Something in the body language of the second attendant, a woman named Maria Okonkwo, ease. 10 years in commercial aviation, with the specific posture of someone who had just been told something she didn't know how to process, registered in Garrett's nervous system like a note played in a minor key. Ease, not alarm, not yet, but attention. The aircraft hit a stretch of mild chop over the Nevada border, ease, and the seatbelt sign came on with its familiar 2-tone chime, ease. Most passengers reached automatically for their belts, ease. A few didn't bother. Nathan Caldwell, who had been on his second Bloody Mary, ease, clicked his buckle with the careful precision of someone managing their coordination, ease. Emily Parker made the standard announcement about returning to seats and ensuring seatbelts were fastened, ease, and her voice was perfectly controlled, professionally warm, ease, giving nothing away. But Garrett heard something beneath it, ease. Not in the words, in the breath behind the words. In the almost imperceptible compression in her delivery at the moment she said, "For your safety." He straightened slightly, ease. He set the letter back in his pocket. The chop smoothed out after about 90 seconds and the seatbelt sign turned off, ease. And the cabin settled back into its routine. And Nathan made a comment to Sandra about turbulence and she responded in monosyllables, ease. And Doug Pierce posted a second video asking if anyone else on this flight was a little nervous about the guy in 4B and got a response that said, "Oh lol, why?" Ease. Carla Jenkins opened her book and read the same paragraph 3 times without absorbing a word of it, ease. And Garrett Callahan sat in seat 4B and listened to the engines, ease, because the engines were talking, not to everyone, ease, to him. They were saying something that nobody else on this aircraft was equipped to hear, ease. Something that was not right, something small, a variation in the harmonic below the normal operating signature, ease. The kind of thing that isn't an alarm, isn't a warning light, ease, isn't a number on a gauge, it's just a sound that isn't quite the sound you know, Ease. And if you have spent enough years inside aircraft, at enough altitudes, in enough circumstances, ease, that almost right sound is louder than any alarm could be. Ease. He closed his eyes. He listened. He identified it. Ease. Not as a specific mechanical failure, not yet, but as the beginning of something. Ease. A question that the aircraft was asking that nobody in this cabin, ease, possibly including the crew, had heard yet. He opened his eyes. Ease. He looked at the forward bulkhead, beyond which sat two pilots he had never met. Ease. Responsible for 114 lives, one of whom was about to face something that his training may or may not have prepared him for. Ease. He took a breath. He was not going to do anything yet. Ease. He was going to listen. He was going to wait. He was going to be ready. Ease. Because that was what he knew how to do. It was when he stripped everything else away, the medals, ease, the missions, the vest, the letter in his pocket, the thing he had always been best at. Ease. Waiting until the exact moment when waiting was no longer the right choice. Ease. And then doing what needed to be done. The aircraft flew on. Ease. The sun rose higher. And in seat 4B, a man who had once carried other people's lives through enemy airspace on nothing but skill and nerve and refusal to quit, held himself completely still, ease, and listened and watched and waited for the moment that was coming. Ease. He didn't know exactly when it would arrive, but he knew it was coming. Ease. He had always known. The sound Garrett heard wasn't loud enough to be a warning. Ease. That was the thing about real danger at altitude. It didn't announce itself with sirens and flashing lights. Ease. Not at first. It crept in under the noise floor of ordinary experience. Ease. Tucked beneath the hum of the ventilation system and the muffled conversations, and the white noise of 37,000 feet of air moving past a fuselage at 540 miles an hour. Ease. It lived in the margins, and the only people who could hear it were the people who had spent enough years in the margins themselves to know what lived there. Ease. Garrett kept his eyes forward and his body still. He had learned in the military that the worst thing you could do in the early seconds of a developing situation was move before you understood it. Ease. Panic was kinetic. Panic was reaching for things, grabbing things. Ease. Standing up, doing something, anything to make the fear feel purposeful. Ease. He had seen experienced pilots make fatal errors because they had confused movement with action. Ease. Activity with response. He was not going to do that. Ease. He was going to listen. The variation in the engine note had been subtle enough that he'd almost talked himself out of it in the first 30 seconds. Ease. Almost. The human brain is very good at talking itself out of uncomfortable perceptions. Ease. Especially in contexts where acting on those perceptions carries a social cost. Ease. He was already the man people were photographing. He was already the man Nathan Caldwell had tried to dress down in front of an audience. Ease. Standing up and walking toward the cockpit, based on something he could hear, but could not yet prove, would be in the judgment of every person in this cabin exactly the kind of irrational, ease, threatening behavior they had been expecting from him since he walked down the jetway. Ease. He knew that. He sat still and he listened. 2 minutes passed. Ease. 3. The variation was still there. Consistent. Not worsening, not yet, but not resolving either. Ease. It sat in the acoustic landscape of the flight, the way a wrong note sits in a piece of music you know by heart. Ease. Technically quiet. Impossible to unhear. Emily Parker came through the cabin with a second round of beverages. Ease. She was moving with the smooth efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times. Ease. But Garrett watched her hands. He watched the way she set a glass down on Nathan's tray table with a fraction of a second's additional care, the kind of micro-adjustment you make when something in your peripheral awareness is. Ease. Asking for a little more of your attention than normal. Ease. And you compensate in small ways without consciously deciding to. Ease. She was hearing something too, or feeling it, or noticing it in the way that 12 years of high-altitude service trains a person's body to notice things that their conscious mind hasn't yet organized into language. Ease. She reached Garrett's row and leaned down with a smile that was completely professional and completely present and gave nothing away. Ease. Anything else for you, sir? No, thank you. He paused for one beat. Ease. How are the guys up front doing? It was a casual question. Ease. The kind of question a nervous flyer might ask to reassure themselves. Ease. The kind of question that sounded like nothing. Emily looked at him for exactly 1 second longer than the question required. Is everything smooth, she said. She moved on. Garrett understood what that meant. Ease. It didn't mean everything was smooth. It meant, I am a professional, and I am not going to discuss the flight deck situation with a passenger. Ease. Which was the correct answer, and the fact that she had paused that extra second before giving it told him that there was a flight deck situation worth not discussing. Ease. He turned and looked out the window. Below and to the left, ease. The Nevada desert was enormous and pale and indifferent. Ease. The kind of landscape that from altitude looks like something God roughed in and then moved on from. Ease. He had looked down at a lot of landscapes from a lot of altitudes. Ease. He had never quite lost the feeling that the earth seen from above was giving you information about how small the man-made things were. Ease. About how the natural geography didn't care about any of it. Ease. About the specific kind of clarity that comes from sufficient distance. Ease. He thought about Lillian. He thought about her clinic, ease, which she had described to him over the phone with the controlled excitement of someone trying not to seem as proud as they were 3 examination rooms. Ease. A waiting area she'd painted herself because she couldn't afford a contractor. Ease. A part-time nurse named Deb who had come out of retirement because ease. In Lillian's words, she said the neighborhood needed her, and honestly, Dad, she was right. He thought about the voicemail. Ease. The way her voice had sounded careful, tentative. Ease. The particular tentativeness of someone who had been disappointed before and was trying to want something without setting themselves up for the specific pain of wanting it too much. Ease. He was going to make it to Seattle. That was not a wish. Ease. That was a statement of intent. The aircraft shuddered. Ease. Not turbulence. Different. A shudder is a single involuntary movement. Ease. And this one came from somewhere deep in the mechanical body of the plane. Ease. Something structural expressing a complaint that hadn't made it to the instrumentation yet or had just arrived there. Ease. And Garrett felt it in his lower back and in the soles of his feet through the floor. Ease. The way you feel the personality of a machine through physical contact when you know that machine well enough. Ease. Nathan Caldwell looked up from his phone with the irritated expression of a man who had been interrupted in the middle of something unimportant. Ease. More turbulence, he said, to no one in particular. Ease. That wasn't turbulence. Ease, Carla Jenkins said quietly. Ease. Before she could stop herself. Nathan looked at her. Ease. Excuse me? Carla pressed her lips together. Nothing. Sorry. But she was right, and some part of her knew it. Ease. And some part of Nathan knew she was right because he looked back down at his phone with an expression that had shifted slightly from irritated to something he wasn't going to name out loud. Ease. Doug Pierce had his phone out again, but this time he wasn't filming the biker in 4B. Ease. He was filming the window and then looking at the window. Ease. And then filming it again, as if the camera might show him something his eyes weren't sure about. He's in the 3rd row. He's a man named Paul Hennessy. He's a retired firefighter from Tempe who had spent 30 years learning to read a room for early signs of developing disaster. He's put down the newspaper he'd been reading and looked at the ceiling of the aircraft with the attentive stillness of someone taking a reading. He didn't say anything, but his hands folded together on his tray table very deliberately. He's the way a man's hands fold when he is getting ready to move fast and wants to know exactly where they are. Garrett did not stand up yet. He was still running calculations. He's not on paper, not on any instrument. In the processor that lived between his ears, the one that had been built over 20 years of missions and emergencies and situations where the data was incomplete and the decision was immediate and the margin for error was approximately 0. He was calculating what he knew, what he didn't know, and what the ratio between those two things required of him in this exact moment. What he knew, there had been an anomaly in the engine sound. There had been a structural shudder inconsistent with normal turbulence. Emily Parker's response to his question had contained information she hadn't meant to give him. What he didn't know, what exactly was happening in the cockpit. What the instruments were showing, whether the crew had it handled, and whether his involvement would help or create a secondary problem in a situation that was already fragile. What the ratio required, 2 more minutes of patience. He gave it 2 more minutes, and then Emily Parker came out of the cockpit door. She was moving differently. The professional composure was still there. She was very good. Ease. And 12 years of training doesn't disappear even under pressure. But the quality of her movement had changed in a way that Garrett recognized instantly, and that most of the cabin did not notice because most of the cabin wasn't. He's watching her with the specific attention he was paying. She was moving with purpose that had an edge on it. Purpose that was organized around something urgent. The difference between a flight attendant conducting service and a flight attendant conducting crisis management is mostly invisible to the untrained eye. It was not invisible to Garrett. She went to the rear galley. Garrett heard at the threshold of audibility a murmured exchange between her and Maria Okonkwo. He couldn't catch the words. He didn't need to. He had his 2 minutes. He stood up. Nathan Caldwell looked up. "What are you doing?" Garrett didn't answer. He moved forward. "Hey." Nathan's voice went up a register. "Hey, where's he going?" "Can someone hey?" The woman in 6C grabbed her husband's arm. Doug Pierce's phone tracked Garrett's movement down the aisle with the faithfulness of a security camera. Garrett reached the forward galley just as Emily was coming back from the rear. They met at the galley curtain. Emily opened her mouth to give him the standard redirection, "Sir, please return to your seat. This area is for crew only." And then she looked at his face, and something stopped her. Not because he looked threatening. Not because he was physical with her in any way. He was standing at a careful distance, his hands visible, his posture deliberately open. But there was something in his expression, or rather in the specific absence of something she usually saw in passengers who were scared or angry or demanding, that made her pause. He wasn't scared. He wasn't performing calm. He wasn't the kind of person who managed their fear by pretending they didn't have it. He was simply not afraid. She had seen that before. In exactly one other context, Emily said. She had not given him her name. She had given him nothing. Her voice dropped by about half its volume. "You need to go back to your seat. Tell me what's happening." "Sir, I need to know what I'm dealing with so I can help you." A pause. "Not so I can feel better, so I can help you." She looked at him. Behind them, the cabin was a rising frequency of whispered conversation. Nathan Caldwell had half risen from his seat. Paul Hennessy hadn't moved. But his whole body was oriented forward with the alert stillness of a man who had decided to see how this played out before he did anything. Emily said very quietly. Captain Briggs collapsed. Cardiac event, 12 minutes ago. Garrett absorbed this without expression. First officer, Ryan Mitchell, 6 years on the line. He's in there now, but we have a rollick problem on top of it. The captain was managing a partial failure in the left system when she stopped. Reorganized. Ryan's holding it, but he needs someone who has dealt with. She stopped again. Limited hydraulics on a commercial aircraft, Garrett said. Yes. What's the aircraft? 737 MAX 8. He nodded. Processing. She took a breath and said what she hadn't said yet. I can't take a passenger into the cockpit without authorization, and I don't have call Ryan right now. Ask him if he wants help. He doesn't know you. No. Garrett looked at her steadily. But you do. Another silence. Something moved across Emily Parker's face, a recognition that she was at the hinge point of a decision that had no safety net on either side. Letting a passenger into a cockpit mid-emergency violated protocols that existed for serious reasons. Not letting a qualified pilot in because of what he was wearing was a different kind of decision with different consequences, in a situation where the consequences were not abstract. She picked up the interphone. She spoke into it quickly. The response from Ryan Mitchell, 22 feet forward and 40,000 feet above the ground, came back in 4 words. Emily relayed those 4 words to Garrett. She said, "He says get in here." The cabin behind them had reached a new frequency. Several passengers had seen the cockpit door open, and Garrett stepped toward it, and the reaction to that visual was immediate and unambiguous. Voices went up. Not screaming, not yet, but the elevated, pressurized sound of a group of people who have just been given a piece of information their nervous systems are not equipped to process calmly. Nathan Caldwell was on his feet. "What is happening?" he said loudly. "Why is that man going into the cockpit? Someone needs to tell us what is happening right now." Carla Jenkins looked at the back of Garrett's head as he moved through the cockpit doorway, and she thought, he's with a clarity that surprised her. That man knows exactly what he's doing. He's. She didn't know why she was certain. She was certain. He's. Paul Hennessy sat back in his seat, and some of the readiness went out of his hands. He's. And he said quietly to the man beside him, whoever that is, he's. I think we're going to be okay. The man beside him said, he's. How can you possibly know that? Paul thought about it. He's. The way he walked, Paul said. Inside the cockpit, he's. Garrett Callahan closed the door behind him, and the sound of the cabin disappeared. He's. What replaced it was the world he had lived in for 20 years. He's. Instruments, readings. The particular quality of attention that a cockpit requires focus, specific, information-dense, built for people who had trained themselves to process multiple data streams simultaneously and make decisions in the spaces between heartbeats. He's. Ryan Mitchell was 34 years old, and he was the best version of 34 years old in the cockpit, competent. He's trained. Not panicking, but he was also alone in a situation that his training had prepared him for in simulation, and that was revealing itself to be different from simulation in the specific ways that emergencies always are. He looked at Garrett. He took in the vest, the patches, the silver blonde hair, and he did the math that a man does in 3 seconds when he is too busy to do anything but math. You're military, F-16, T-38, multiple platforms. Also type-rated on the 737 Classic, 3,000 hours. Ryan looked back at his instruments. The hydraulic situation? Tell me where you are. Ryan walked him through it in the clip, precise language of aviation, where words are stripped to their load-bearing minimum because every syllable costs time. Left hydraulic system at 40% and dropping. Right system nominal, but carrying the load of both. Spoilers on the left wing responding sluggishly. They were 212 miles from Seattle-Tacoma. 38,000 feet, and every mile they flew forward was a mile they committed to a landing that was going to require everything the right system had and everything both of them could bring to the controls. Garrett settled into the left seat. He ran his hands over the controls without touching them. Reading them. The way a surgeon reads a patient, not yet acting. But establishing contact, establishing understanding. Establishing the relationship between his intent and the machine's capacity. Your altitude's good, he said. Your heading is good. How are the engines stable? Autopilot status? On. But I've been hand flying since the left system started showing the drop. I don't trust it to compensate correctly with asymmetric hydraulics. Smart. Garrett looked at the approach plate Ryan had pulled up on the navigation display. You're planning Seattle-Tacoma? Originally, I've been thinking about Renton. Shorter final approach, less traffic to coordinate around. Garrett considered this for exactly 2 seconds. No, Seattle-Tacoma. They have equipment. They have foam trucks. You want every resource on the ground when you land this thing. And SeaTac is where those resources are. Ryan didn't argue. He nodded once, the nod of a man who had been thinking the same thing and needed someone to confirm it. I'm going to need to brief my airline, Ryan said. I know. Do it. I'll hold her steady. Ryan reached for the radio. And Garrett Callahan. 52 years old. Combat veteran. Hell's Angel. Man in the wrong seat on the wrong flight, going to see his daughter for the first time in 3 years. Placed his hands on the controls of a crippled commercial aircraft carrying 114 people through the airspace above the Pacific Northwest. And felt beneath the weight of the situation, beneath the calculation and the responsibility and the specific gravity of what was happening, something that he hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness, not excitement, rightness. The deep structural rightness of a person doing the exact thing they were built to do, in the exact moment that thing was required. He adjusted the trim. He listened to the aircraft. The aircraft, as it always did when someone who understood it was at the controls, began to talk back. Behind the cockpit door, the cabin was a different world entirely. Emily Parker had returned to the cabin the moment Garrett entered the cockpit because her job was out here with the 112 people who were now in varying states of alarm and needed to be managed. He's informed, reassured, and in some cases, talked down from the particular ledge of panic that high-altitude crisis sits people on without warning. Ease. She stood at the front of the cabin, and she used her voice the way she had learned to use it clear. Ease. Present human, carrying information without carrying fear. Ease. Ladies and gentlemen, your attention, please. We are experiencing a minor mechanical situation that our flight crew is handling. Ease. We have additional aviation expertise assisting on the flight deck. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. I will update you as I have information. For a moment, the cabin absorbed this. Then Nathan Caldwell said, at full volume, additional aviation expertise. Are you talking about the biker? Are you actually telling us that a Hell's Angel is flying this plane right now? Emily looked at him directly. I'm telling you that a qualified aviator is assisting our first officer. Yes, that's insane. Nathan's voice was climbing. That is absolutely insane. I want to know who authorized, sir. Emily's voice did not rise to meet his. It stayed exactly where it was, level and certain. Raising your voice will not help this situation. Sitting down and fastening your seatbelt will. Nathan looked around the cabin for the ally he expected to find there. For the coalition of alarmed, reasonable people who shared his assessment of the situation. He found Carla Jenkins looking at him with an expression he didn't immediately know how to categorize. He found Paul Hennessy sitting calmly with his belt fastened and his hands folded. He found Doug Pierce, whose phone was down for the first time since Phoenix, who looked like a man reconsidering several recent decisions simultaneously. Nathan sat down. He fastened his seatbelt. Sandra Whitmore, beside him, said nothing. But she put her hand on the armrest between them. Not touching him, just there. Present. Because that was the thing altitude and crisis had a way of doing to the hierarchies people built around themselves. It dissolved them very fast, very completely. In seat 4A, Carla Jenkins opened her mouth and then closed it and then opened it again and said, to no one and everyone, I think we need to trust the people who know what they're doing. Nobody argued. The aircraft banked gently left, beginning its new routing towards Seattle-Tacoma. In the cockpit, Ryan Mitchell finished his radio call with dispatch and looked at Garrett. They want verification of your credentials. I know. My company's legal team is Ryan. Garrett's voice was completely easy. When we're on the ground, your legal team can ask me anything they want. Right now, how's the left system reading? Ryan checked. 33%. Still dropping. Garrett nodded once. Then we focus, he said. He made a small adjustment to their descent profile. He calculated. Without being asked, the optimal approach speed given the asymmetric hydraulic load. The likely behavior of the spoilers at 60% extension. The crosswind component at SeaTac runway 16R and the stopping distance they would need to account for the possibility that the braking system was carrying more hydraulic stress than its design had anticipated. He ran those numbers in his head the way other people did arithmetic. Then he reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out the letter. He looked at it for exactly 1 second, the handwriting, visible through the fold. His own careful print, the words he had worked so hard to find. He put it back in his pocket. We're going to land this airplane, he said. Mostly to himself, or maybe to Lillian, or maybe to the aircraft itself. Yeah, Ryan Mitchell said. Outside, Seattle was still 200 miles away. Inside, 114 people were breathing with varying degrees of difficulty. Holding armrests with varying degrees of force and thinking with remarkable unanimity about the specific people they would call when this was over. Nathan Caldwell was thinking about his kids. Paul Hennessy was thinking about his wife of 38 years. Carla Jenkins was thinking about her daughter in Seattle. About the particular sound of her daughter's voice on the phone. About how she had almost not taken this trip and had booked it on impulse 3 weeks ago because of a feeling she couldn't entirely explain. Doug Pierce was not thinking about social media. He was thinking about his mother, who lived in Spokane, who he hadn't visited in 7 months, who had told him on their last call that she was fine. I'm always fine. Stop worrying. And whom he was going to visit the moment he got off this plane. Ease. Right after he deleted 2 videos, he no longer felt good about having taken. Ease. The aircraft descended. The hydraulics held. The man in the cockpit held them. Ease. And the letter in his inside pocket, 1-page, handwritten. Ease. The 4th draft, the honest one, waited with the particular patience of words that have already done the hardest part of their work. Ease, which is being written. The rest was just delivery. Ease. The left hydraulic system hit 28% at exactly the moment Ryan Mitchell said, Ease. We have a problem with the spoilers. Garrett didn't look up from the instruments. Ease. Define problem. Left bank is responding at about 40% commanded deflection. Ease. I'm getting asymmetric lift when I tried to reduce speed below 240. Garrett processed this in the space of a breath. Ease. Asymmetric lift on approach was the kind of problem that turned a difficult landing into an impossible one if you let it get ahead of you. Ease. The spoilers on the left wing were responsible for killing lift during descent and braking after touchdown. Ease. At 40% response, they were working barely, but working meant nothing if the hydraulic pressure continued to drop. Ease. Because there was a threshold below which 40% became 20% became 0. Ease. And 0 meant the aircraft would want to roll left at the exact moment they needed it to fly absolutely straight. Ease. What's our distance? Garrett asked. 162 miles to SeaTac. At current fuel burn? Comfortable. Ease. Fuel is not our problem. Good. Garrett adjusted the throttle by a fraction that registered in the aircraft's behavior before it registered on any instrument. Ease. We're going to fly this approach faster than your book speed. He's 10 knots above ref. Ryan looked at him. That increases our landing roll. I know. Ease. But it keeps the spoilers in their effective range longer on the way down. Ease. We bleed speed on final, not on base leg. We keep authority over the aircraft until the last possible moment. Ease. Ryan thought about this for exactly the amount of time a pilot thinks about something when another pilot proposes a deviation from standard procedure which is long enough to find the flaw. Ease. And when you can't find the flaw, you nod. He nodded. Ease. I need to tell the cabin, Ryan said. Let Emily handle the cabin. Ease. She's doing it. Ryan looked at his radio. I need to declare, you declared 12 minutes ago. I need to upgrade it. Ease. The hydraulic situation has progressed. Garrett was already recalculating their approach profile in his head. Ease. Adjusting for the spoiler limitation, building in the margins that the situation now required. Ease. Do it, he said. I've got the aircraft. Ryan keyed the radio. Ease. What he said to Seattle Center was calm and specific and used the language of aviation emergency with the precision it deserved. Ease. And Seattle Center came back within 4 seconds with an amended routing. Ease. A dedicated frequency. And the information that SeaTac's emergency services were already positioning. Ease. Behind them, through the sealed cockpit door, 112 passengers heard nothing of this exchange. Ease. What they heard instead was Emily Parker's voice, and the quality of that voice was something several of them would describe later with the same word, ease, which was steady, not artificially calm, not the performed serenity of someone who is hiding the truth, ease, but steady in the way that a person is steady when they have decided that the people around them need their steadiness more than they need their fear, ease, and they have made that decision completely and without reservation, ease. Ladies and gentlemen, Emily said, I want to give you an update. Ease. We're continuing our descent towards Seattle, Tacoma. Ease. Our first officer is managing the aircraft with assistance from a highly qualified aviator currently on the flight deck. Ease. Emergency services at Seattle, Tacoma have been notified as a precaution. Ease. And they will be available when we land. This is standard procedure, and it is not cause for alarm. Ease. I am going to ask everyone to ensure your seatbelts are fastened and tightened. Ease. That your tray tables are stowed and that your carry-on items are secured. Ease. If you have any questions, please press your call button and I will come to you personally. She stopped. Ease. She let that sit in the air for 2 seconds. Then she said, Ease, we are going to land safely. The cabin held that statement. Ease. Nathan Caldwell was gripping his armrest with a force that had turned his knuckles pale. Ease. He was not speaking. He had not spoken since the seatbelt moment. Ease. And something in the radical silence he was maintaining suggested that the silence was costing him something, that it was being purchased with effort. Ease. Minute by minute, as a replacement for the noise he would normally be making. Ease. Sandra Whitmore, beside him, was working through the rosary beads she kept in her jacket pocket, and which she had not used since her mother's funeral 3 years ago. She was not Catholic. The beads had been her mother's. She kept them for reasons she had never explained to anyone. She was explaining them to herself now. Doug Pierce had put his phone completely away. He's not in his hand, face down on the tray table. He's in his bag, zipped up, as if removing it from his immediate environment was the only morally coherent act available to him. He was sitting with his hands in his lap, and he was thinking about the videos he had posted the caption, the laughing emojis, the followers who had responded with more laughing emojis, and he was experiencing something that social media had spent years training him to avoid experiencing, which was the unmediated, unfiltered weight of having been completely and publicly wrong about a person in a way that was documented and permanent and currently being read by other people. He pressed his call button. Emily came to him. Yes, he stopped. Started again. Is there anything I can do to help? Anyone? Emily looked at him for a moment. She saw what she saw. Stay seated, seatbelt on, she said. That's the most helpful thing right now. He nodded. It wasn't enough, and he knew it wasn't enough, but it was what was available. Paul Hennessy. He's the retired firefighter in 3C. Had entered a state that his wife of 38 years would have recognized immediately the operational stillness he went into during a crisis. The one that looked from the outside like passivity, but was actually the complete inverse. A total gathering of self that required quiet as its working condition. He was watching the flight attendants. He was watching the exits. He was watching the posture of the people around him for the early signs of cascade panic. The kind that started in one person and moved through a confined space like current through water. The kind he had learned to interrupt before it started, because interrupting it after was exponentially harder. If something else went wrong, Paul Hennessy was going to be useful. He was certain of this the way he was certain of most things. Without drama, without announcement, as a simple operational fact. In seat 4A, Carla Jenkins had closed her book 12 minutes ago and had not reopened it. She was holding it in her lap with both hands, not reading it. Just holding it, the way people hold things when they need something solid, and the solid things available to them are limited. She was thinking about her daughter in Seattle, whose name was Grace, who was 34 years old and had her father's laugh and her mother's stubbornness, and who had said, when Carla told her she was coming up for a visit, Mom, finally, I've been asking you for months. That word sitting in the middle of Carla's chest with its full weight. She thought about the things she had put off saying to Grace, because there would always be more time, because the next call would be better, because she would say it properly when she saw her in person. And now here she was 37,000 feet above the ground, in an aircraft with a hydraulic problem and an unconscious captain. And the things she had meant to say were waiting in the same place they'd always been. And the distance between herself and the person she wanted to say them to was 162 miles of air and everything that could happen in it. She made herself a promise. It was not a complicated promise. It was 3 sentences long, and she made it to herself in the particular interior voice that doesn't negotiate and doesn't postpone and doesn't allow for comfortable vagueness about intention. She would say the things. She would say them first, before anything else, the moment she saw Grace. She would not wait. Inside the cockpit, the left hydraulic system crossed 25%. Garrett felt the change before Ryan's instrument registered it, a very slight increase in the physical resistance of the control column on the left side. The aircraft's muscles developing the early stiffness that came from reduced fluid pressure in the system that powered them. He said nothing about this to Ryan yet. There was nothing to say yet. Information without actionable implication was noise. And noise was the enemy of clarity in a cockpit. And clarity was the only thing keeping 114 people moving forward through this moment toward the next one. He thought about F-16 hydraulic failures at 12,000 feet over terrain that didn't show up on civilian maps. Ease. He thought about the specific arithmetic of staying alive when the machine you're inside starts reducing its cooperation with your intention. He had been here before. Not here exactly, but close enough that the skills transferred. Ryan, he said. Yeah. When's the last time you did a manual reversion approach? Ryan's answer took a half-second longer than it should have. Simulator. 8 months ago. How did it go? Third attempt. Garrett nodded once. The nod of a man who is revising his calculations, but not his confidence. Okay, we're not going to manual reversion unless the right system starts showing stress too. Right now, the right system is nominal. We're going to use it, and if it starts dropping, then we'll have that conversation. But we don't borrow problems we don't have yet. Ryan was quiet for a moment. Then, you've done a manual reversion approach. Actually done one. It wasn't a question. Twice, Garrett said, both in military platforms. The physics aren't identical, but the principles are the same. You maintain authority, you fly the aircraft, you don't let the aircraft fly you. Ryan absorbed this. How did those go? Garrett glanced at him for exactly 1 second. I'm here. Ryan almost laughed. It was the kind of almost law that happens in cockpits during emergencies when someone says something true in a way that acknowledges the whole specific weight of the situation and somehow makes it lighter for exactly the duration of a breath. It was one of the most useful sounds Garrett had heard in the last 30 minutes. Okay, Ryan said. What do you need from me? Tell me about the crew. Your flight attendants, how are they? Emily's solid. She's the best I've flown with. Maria's good too. Less experience. But she follows Emily's lead well. Good. Passengers, Emily's managing them. I've been focused on, I know. That's correct. You focus on this. She manages that. That's how this works. A pause. Anyone in the cabin I should know about? Elderly children? Ryan reached for the interphone. Called Emily, asked her. Emily's voice came back through the speaker with the inventory. 2 passengers over 70, 1 traveling with a child under 5. 1 passenger in 11D who had informed her at boarding that he had a heart condition and was traveling with medication. No one in active distress. Tell her, Garrett said, that if 11D shows any symptoms, she doesn't wait. She comes to us immediately. Ryan relayed this. She says understood, Ryan reported. Good. Garrett checked the altimeter. They were at 34,000 feet. Descending. The ride was smooth, which was the one cooperative thing the situation was doing. No weather, no wind shear, no turbulence to add variables to an equation already carrying more variables than he preferred. Smooth air was a gift. He took it. The interphone buzzed. Ryan answered. His face changed. Not dramatically, he was too controlled for dramatic, but the quality of his attention shifted in a way that Garrett caught immediately. What Garrett said. Ryan held up 1 finger. Listen. Responded in 2 words. Hung up. He looked at his hydraulic pressure gauge for the right system. The right system, which had been nominal, which had been their margin. Their cushion, their backup, and their primary, and everything in between showed a pressure reading that was 4% below where it had been 6 minutes ago. 4% was within the range of sensor fluctuation. It might be nothing. It might not be nothing. Right system is showing a drop, Ryan said. Garrett looked at the gauge. He looked at it with the specific quality of attention that aviation requires when data first arrives that you hoped wouldn't. The attention that is simultaneously processing the number. Its implication. The rate of change. The possible causes. And the decision tree that branches from each possible cause. How long ago did it start? Emily's call was from the rear. Maria noticed a change in cabin pressurization indicators near the rear equipment bay. Could be connected. Meaning the hydraulic leak might not be isolated to the left system. Meaning it might be a common source. Garrett sat with this for 3 seconds, which was a long time. A common source hydraulic failure on a 737 was rare. It was in the range of events that manufacturers describe as extremely improbable, which was aviation language, for it happens in nature, but we don't like to say that out loud. It happened when a failure in a shared component, a reservoir, A pump junction, a common line propagated to both systems instead of being contained by the redundancy that was supposed to prevent exactly this. Ease. We need to start thinking about manual reversion, Garrett said. Ease. Ryan's jaw tightened. We're at 94 miles. I know where we are. Manual reversion at this distance. Is with this aircraft. Without Ryan. Garrett's voice was level. Ease. Not hard. Level. The voice of someone who needs the other person to stay in their lane because the lane is narrow and they are both in it together. Ease. Tell me what manual reversion requires from you right now. Ryan stopped. Ease. Breathe. Went through it. Higher control forces. Ease. More pilot input to achieve the same aircraft response. Ease. Significantly more physical effort on approach and flare. What else? Tighter speed control. Ease. No room for energy mismanagement. Correct. And what do you have in this seat right now that helps with all of that? Ryan looked at Garrett. Ease. Someone who has done it before, he said. Someone who has done it before, Garrett confirmed. Ease. So we are not underprepared for this. We are differently prepared than either of us expected this morning. Ease. And differently prepared is not the same as underprepared. Ease. Are we clear? Ryan nodded. Say it out loud, Garrett said. Ryan said, we're clear. Good. Ease. Now give me a manual reversion checklist. Ryan reached for the QRH, the Quick Reference Handbook, which lived in the side pocket of the cockpit and which contained the answer to every question you hoped you never had to ask. Ease. He opened it to the section he needed and began reading the steps. Ease. And Garrett listened with the focused attention of a man who had done this in conditions that didn't permit a QRH. Ease. Who had done it from memory in the dark over terrain that had no name. Ease. And who was using this reading now not as instruction but as confirmation, checking his memory against the book. Ease. Making sure 17 years hadn't eroded any critical detail from the architecture of what he knew. Ease. Nothing had eroded. Some things, it turned out, the body doesn't let go of. Ease. Behind the cockpit door, the cabin had reached the particular state that precedes understanding the state where people know something has changed, but don't yet know what. Ease. Where the silence has a different texture than the silence before. Ease. Where people look at each other and look away, because looking at each other requires acknowledgement that you are both in the same place and you are both afraid. Ease. Nathan Caldwell was looking at his hands on the armrest. Ease. White-knuckled, and he was looking at them as if they belonged to someone else. Ease. As if the person who had spent the flight performing confidence and contempt and social dominance had stepped away and left only the man beneath the man who had kids at home in Phoenix. Ease. A son who was 12 and a daughter who was 9, who had called him last week to ask if he was coming to her soccer game and whom he had told, probably, sweetheart. He's probably. Let me check my calendar. He had not checked his calendar. Ease. He had not gone to the soccer game. The armrest under his white-knuckled hands was exactly the width of a person's regret, when regret is the only available object. Sandra Whitmore, he's beside him. Ease. Finished her rosary without looking at him. Ease. And then she said very quietly, I have 2 boys. He's 18 and 20. Nathan looked at her. They think I work too much, she said. He said nothing. They're right, she said. He looked back at his hands. I have a daughter. She asked me to come to her soccer game. Sandra didn't respond. She didn't need to. The aircraft shuddered again, shorter than before. Different in its frequency, higher, more insistent. The sound of something mechanical working harder than it was designed to work, because the system that was supposed to share the load was failing to do so. A woman in row 7 made a sound that was not quite a cry and then pressed her hand over her mouth. The man beside her put his arm around her without speaking. The simple, complete gesture of someone who has decided that physical presence is the only thing they have to offer, and they are offering it without reservation. Paul Hennessy turned in his seat and made eye contact with a man in row 8 who looked like he was about 10 seconds from doing something unhelpful. Paul held the eye contact and gave a very small, deliberate nod. The man in row 8 took a breath and nodded back and settled in his seat. That was all it took. Sometimes that is all it takes. Emily Parker watched this from the forward galley and filed it away with the same professional thoroughness. She filed everything the retired firefighter in 3C was a resource, but not just a passenger. If she needed to organize the cabin, he was her anchor point. She hoped she wouldn't need to organize the cabin. She was doing the same math Garrett was doing. From the outside, with less information. She knew the hydraulics were degrading. She knew the right system was now in question. She knew they were approximately 90 miles from Seattle-Tacoma, and that emergency vehicles were on the ground, and that the man in the left seat had flown combat missions and had done the specific thing they might now need him to do in the actual, dark above actual enemies with actual consequences. And that if that man said they were going to be okay, she was going to choose to believe him. Not because she had no choice. Because she had looked in his eyes. She had looked in his eyes and seen what she had seen 12 years ago at a military memorial ceremony she had attended because her older brother had served with a man whose name was on the program. She had seen the eyes of people who had learned to carry other people's lives as a matter of professional routine. People for whom the weight of responsibility had become load-bearing, not a burden that bent them but a structure they built on. She had not placed the face then, she was placing it now. She picked up the interphone. "Garrett," she said. A brief pause. Then his voice, even and attentive. "Go ahead, Emily. There was a ceremony," she said. 2013, at Davis-Monthan. My brother's unit had a memorial. They read names. They read your name. Silence. You were listed as missing, she said. And then you weren't. Another silence. Then, I came home, I know. Her voice held something for a moment that she didn't try to contain. My brother talked about you. He said you were the best pilot he'd ever seen fly. He said you made everyone around you feel like it was going to be okay. Emily. Yeah, I need you to make your cabin feel like it's going to be okay. She almost smiled. He's working on it. I know you are. A pause. Tell me your brother's name. Marcus Parker. He's Staff Sergeant 5th. A longer pause. I remember Marcus, Garrett said quietly. He was a good man. He still is, Emily said. He's in Portland. He owns a garage. Something shifted in Garrett's voice. He's something small and genuine. Good, he said. That's real good. She hung up. She turned to face the cabin. She took a breath. She thought about Marcus, who was in Portland fixing cars and was going to get the longest phone call of his life tonight. She thought about the man in the cockpit who had once been missing and had come home, and was now the most important person on this aircraft to 114 people who didn't know his name. She thought about what he'd said. Make your cabin feel like it's going to be okay. She walked to the center of the cabin and she stood where everyone could see her. I want to talk to you, she said. Not the announcement voice. Her own voice, personal and present and utterly without performance. Not as a flight announcement, just to you. The cabin went quiet in a way it hadn't been quiet before. A different quality of quiet. I've been in aviation for 12 years, she said. I have been on flights with mechanical issues before. I have never been on a flight where I felt more certain that we are in capable hands. The man assisting our first officer right now is someone I know by reputation and by record. He is a decorated combat pilot with more than 3,000 hours in military aircraft. He has been in situations that were worse than this, and he has brought people home. She paused. We are going home, she said. Nathan Caldwell's hands loosened on the armrest. Not completely, but noticeably. The woman in row 7 made another sound. But this one was different, less fear in it, more release. Paul Hennessy looked at Emily Parker with the specific respect that emergency professionals have for other emergency professionals when they watch them do their job under conditions that don't allow for mistakes. And in the cockpit, 70 miles from Seattle-Tacoma. Garrett Callahan heard none of this because the door was closed and he was busy with the aircraft, which was asking more of him than it had been asking 15 minutes ago. The right system now reading 11% below baseline and the control forces already measurably heavier in his hands. He was compensating. He was compensating the way he always compensated, which was continuously and without announcement, making the small adjustments that kept the divergence between where the aircraft wanted to go and where it needed to go as close to zero as the situation allowed. His hands were steady, his breathing was slow, his heart rate, which his flight surgeon had once described as disturbingly low, was exactly what it always was. Ryan was watching the instruments with the focused attention of a man who has accepted that the situation is what it is and has organized himself around competence rather than fear, which is exactly what Garrett needed from him. 60 miles, Ryan said. I see it. Right system is holding at minus 12% from base. Not accelerating. Good. Let's see if that holds. And if it doesn't. Garrett moved his hand slightly on the control column, a micro adjustment, barely visible in response to a micro change in the aircraft's behavior that Ryan's instruments wouldn't show for another 30 seconds. Then we do what we trained for, he said. He thought about Lillian. He thought about the letter in his pocket. He thought about a 12-year-old version of himself. Standing outside an air show in Tucson with his father. Watching a military demonstration aircraft come out of a maneuver that seemed to defy what the sky was supposed to allow. And feeling something open up in his chest that had never fully closed. The runway at Seattle-Tacoma was 60 miles away. The aircraft was talking to him through the controls, through the resistance in the column, through the way the trim needed constant small corrections to hold their altitude and heading in the way it wouldn't if both systems were nominal. He listened, he talked back, not with words, with everything he knew. 50 miles out, the right hydraulic system dropped another 8% in 4 minutes. Garrett felt it before Ryan said it. The control column had developed a quality he knew from 2 specific moments in his life, a resistance that wasn't mechanical resistance. Wasn't the normal pushback of a properly functioning flight control system. But the heavier, more effortful resistance of a system that was working on diminishing resources and communicating that fact through the only language available to it, which was physical force transmitted through metal into the hands of the person holding it. His hands were holding it. We're going to manual reversion, Garrett said. Ryan didn't argue. He'd been watching the same numbers. No, not yet. But we set up for it now, so that when we cross the threshold, we're already there. I don't want to be transitioning at 5 miles on final. Agreed. Ryan reached for the checklist. He had it open before Garrett finished the sentence. They worked through it together, not fast, not slow. But at the pace that the procedure required, which was deliberate and sequential, and allowed no room for skipping steps because you thought you already knew them. Garrett had known pilots who skipped steps. He had attended 2 of their memorials. Every item on the checklist received its full attention. Every response was spoken aloud and confirmed. This was not ceremony. This was architecture. The checklist was the architecture of survival. Built by engineers and pilots who had come before them and had learned, sometimes at cost, exactly what the sequence needed to be. Outside the cockpit, the cabin had settled into a new kind of stillness. Emily Parker had not sat down since her address to the passengers 15 minutes ago. She was moving galley to cabin, row to row, the quiet, purposeful movement of a woman who had made a decision about what her job required and was executing it without interruption. She was checking faces. She was making eye contact. She was touching shoulders when touching was the right thing, and being present without touching when presence was what was needed instead. She stopped at Paul Hennessy's row. You're a first responder, she said. Not a question. He looked at her with mild surprise. Retired. 30 years fire and rescue. If I need help managing the cabin in the next 20 minutes, will you be available? He had been available since Phoenix. Yes, ma'am, he said. She moved on. She stopped at Nathan Caldwell's row. He looked up at her, and his face was not the face of the man who had boarded the aircraft 3 hours ago. That face had been assembled from money and position, and the particular armor that people build when they have spent long enough being told they are exceptional. This face was just a man's face, 44 years old. Slightly pale, holding something in his expression that he didn't have words for yet, because he had spent most of his adult life treating words as instruments of negotiation rather than communication. And what he needed right now was not a negotiating tool. Is there anything you need? Emily asked. He opened his mouth. He's closed it. My kids are in Phoenix, he said. I have a daughter. She's 9. What's her name? He blinked. Harper's going to see her dad today, Emily said. Ease. He looked at her for a long moment and then he nodded. Ease. And something in his jaw released by a fraction that cost him more than the people watching him would ever know. Ease. She moved on. In the cockpit, Ryan had just completed the manual reversion setup checklist. Ease. Complete, he said. Confirm spoiler bypass switches confirmed. Alternate flap position? Set. Brake accumulator pressure? Ryan checked. Ease. Checked again. Pressure is in the green. But if we lose right system entirely before touchdown, the accumulator gives us approximately 8 brake applications, Garrett said. Ease, we will not need 8. We will need 2, possibly 3. Ease. The accumulator is enough. Ryan absorbed this. You're sure? I'm sure that it's enough for what we're going to do. Ease. I'm not sure about anything that deviates from what we're going to do. Ease. So we're not going to deviate. This was the particular quality of certainty that Garrett carried, not the false certainty of someone performing confidence. Ease. But the working certainty of someone who has built a plan on solid principles and is committed to executing it, because commitment itself is a structural component of the plan. Ease. Doubt was not absent. Doubt was present and accounted for and assigned its correct weight, which was, he's acknowledged, noted. He's not permitted to drive. Ease. Ryan understood this. He had understood it for the last hour. Ease. In the way that a less experienced person understands something from someone more experienced, not by being told, but by watching the thing operate in real time and recognizing it for what it is. Ease, he said. What do you need from me on final? Call altitude. Ease. Call airspeed deviations greater than 3 knots. Ease. Call any instrument that moves outside its green arc. Ease. Everything else I fly. And if something changes that changes the plan, tell me immediately. Ease. No filter, no editing. Raw data. Fast, understood. Garrett looked at the navigation display. Ease 41 miles. Seattle-Tacoma's runway 16L was loaded in the FMS, the longer runway. Ease. The one with the most stopping distance. Ease. The one he had chosen not because the approach was easier, but because once they were on the ground, he wanted every foot of concrete that existed between the nose of this aircraft and the end of the available surface. Ease. He keyed the radio. Seattle approach, flight 719 with you. Ease. 40 miles, manual reversion procedures in effect. Ease. Requesting straight-in runway 16L. Seattle approach came back in 4 seconds flat. Ease. The controller's voice was controlled and professional and carried the specific quality of someone who had been briefed and was organized and was going to give this aircraft everything it needed. Ease. Flight 719. Ease Seattle approach. Ease runway 16L cleared. Straight in. All traffic held. Emergency services positioned. Ease winds 170 at 12, gusting to 18. Ease. Say souls on board and fuel state. Ryan answered the fuel and souls query while Garrett maintained the aircraft. Ease. 114 souls. He had carried that number in his head since Emily told him in the galley. Ease. He carried it the way he had always carried the number of people, depending on his decisions, not as weight. Ease, not as burden, but as precision. Ease. 114 specific people who had boarded an aircraft in Phoenix this morning with intentions and plans and soccer games they had promised to attend, and daughters they were going to see, and mothers they were going to call. Ease. And who were now 39 miles from a runway, and depending on 2 pilots and a set of flight controls running on a hydraulic system that was at 31% of normal capacity and descending. Ease. He made a trim adjustment. He made another. The aircraft was getting heavier in his hands with each passing minute. Ease. Not dramatically, the change was incremental. The kind of change you could almost talk yourself into thinking you were imagining. Ease. Except that Garrett's hands had spent 20 years learning the difference between imagined and real. Ease, and this was real. Ease, and it required constant active ease. Physical correction that would have been automatic at full hydraulic pressure and was now deliberate and effortful and could not be relaxed for the duration of what remained. Ease. His hands did not shake. They never had. The interphone buzzed. Ease. Ryan answered. His face changed in the way Garrett had learned to read over the last 90 minutes, not dramatically. Ease. Not with the broad telegraphing of someone performing an emotions. ease, but in the small muscular shifts around the eyes and jaw that happened in people who were trying to process something while simultaneously maintaining control of other things. Ease. He hung up. 11D, Ryan said, the passenger with the heart condition. Garrett felt the shape of this immediately. Ease. Symptoms, Emily says he's conscious, he's medicated. Ease, but he's showing chest pressure. She wants to know if we can expedite. 38 miles. Ease. At their current speed and descent profile, approximately 11 minutes to touchdown. Ease. Garrett's mind moved through the options in the time it took most people to identify that there were options. Increasing speed would reduce the time, but increase the energy they'd need to bleed on a final. Ease. Which meant more brake applications, which meant more demand on the accumulator and the compromised right system. Ease. Maintaining current profile meant 11 minutes, which for a cardiac event was a meaningful difference from 8 minutes. Ease. How's he presenting? Garrett asked. Ryan relayed the question. Ease. Got the answer, relayed it back. Pressure only. No radiation. Ease. Pulse is elevated but not critical. Emily says he's scared. Ease. Which is making the pressure worse. Tell Emily to sit with him. He's not a crew member. Emily herself, Ryan looked at him. She's managing the cabin. Paul Hennessy in 3C can manage the cabin. Tell her. Ryan relayed this without further argument. He had stopped arguing about Garrett's judgment approximately 30 minutes ago. At around the moment he had understood that Garrett's judgment was not operating from ego or authority, but from a clear-eyed reading of what each situation required. Across the cabin, Emily Parker received the message via interphone. Looked once at Paul Hennessy. Made eye contact. Pointed at him, and then gestured toward the front of the cabin. And Paul Hennessy unfastened his seatbelt and stood up and moved to the position she indicated with the unhurried competence of a man who had been waiting to be useful for the last hour and was now being given the opportunity. Emily went to 11D. The man in 11D was 67 years old. His name was Gerald Watkins, and he had been flying to Seattle to visit his cardiologist for a follow-up after a stent procedure 6 months ago. Which was one of those biographical facts that felt, in this particular moment, like the universe's idea of a dark joke. He was gripping the armrest with his left hand and had his right hand flat against the center of his chest. And his breathing was the careful, controlled breathing of a man who was trying to slow something down that kept trying to go faster. Emily sat in the empty seat beside him without asking permission. Gerald, she said. He looked at her with the eyes of a man who was frightened and was being very brave about it in a way that was costing him considerably. I'm Emily. I know, he said. You told me when I boarded. I want to sit with you for a few minutes. You don't have to, I want to. She put her hand over his on the armrest. Talk to me. Tell me something. Tell me about Seattle. Who are you seeing up there? He looked at her hand on his. Some of the grip in his fingers released. My son, he said. He's David. He lives in Bellevue. Has 2 kids. He's 7 and 4. He took a careful breath. I haven't met the 4-year-old in person yet. He's just video calls. What's the 4-year-old's name? Rosie. And despite everything, despite the altitude and the hydraulics and the pressure in his chest and the fear that had been sitting on him since the first shudder, something happened in Gerald Watkins' face when he said that name. Something warm and undeniable. Tell me about Rosie, Emily said. And Gerald Watkins. He's 67 years old. He's cardiac patient. He's 36,000 feet above the state of Washington. He's started telling Emily Parker about a 4-year-old named Rosie, who had apparently informed her father that dogs were better than people because dogs didn't have opinions. Which had been assessed by the entire family as demonstrating either advanced wisdom or early comedic talent. And as he talked, the grip in his hand continued to ease, and his breathing continued to slow, and the pressure in his chest, while not gone, became something he was carrying rather than something carrying him. Emily Parker sat beside him and listened like she had nowhere else in the world to be. 29 miles. In the cockpit, Garrett was hand-flying the aircraft through the descent with a focus that had the quality of meditation, not the absence of thought, but the disciplined organization of thought around a single sustained intention. Every sensor in his body was pointed at the aircraft. The weight in the controls, the attitude. the airspeed that was 3 knots above the speed he'd calculated for this configuration, and that he was going to begin bleeding precisely at the outer marker. Ease. The wind, which was doing what the controller had said it would do 12 knots down the runway with gusts to 18. Ease. Which was manageable, which was within the math, which did not get to be a problem, because he was not going to allow it. Ease. 27 miles, Ryan said. Flap setting? Flaps 15. Ease. As briefed. Gear? Ready on your call. I'd recommend holding 18 miles. Ease. I want the drag, but I want the hydraulic demand managed. Ease. We drop gear at 18. 18, Ryan confirmed. Ease. The right hydraulic system was at 22%. Ease. Garrett had done the math on 22%. He had done it 3 different ways and gotten the same answer all 3 times. Ease, which was enough. Not comfortable. Not with the margins he preferred. Ease. But enough to complete this landing if they executed correctly and the system held its current percentage and didn't accelerate its decline in the next 9 minutes. Ease. 9 minutes. He thought about the letter in his pocket. Ease. He did not take it out. He kept both hands where they needed to be. Ease on the controls, feeling the aircraft through his palms and his fingers with the complete attentiveness of someone for whom this moment was not theoretical and not simulated and not anything other than precisely what it was. Ease. But he thought about it. He thought about the 4th draft. Ease. The honest one, the one that said, in the plainest language he could manage. Ease. That he was sorry for the years when he had not been the father she deserved. Ease. And that he was proud of her beyond his capacity to express it adequately. Ease. And that the clinic she had built in the neighborhood that needed it, it was the most impressive thing he had ever seen any person do. Ease. And that he was asking, not expecting, not assuming. Ease. Just asking if there was room for him to do better going forward. Ease. That was what the letter said. He had rewritten it 4 times because the first 3 drafts had all been, ease in various ways, about him. About his struggle, his growth, his journey. The 4th draft understood that the letter was not for him. It was for her. And so the 4th draft was about her, about who she was, what she had built, what he saw when he looked at her life. It was the hardest thing he had written. It was 1 page. 20 miles, Ryan said. Garrett began the final adjustment to their descent rate. In the cabin, Paul Hennessy was standing at the front, calm and large and authoritative in the specific way of people who have spent 30 years being the steady thing in unstable situations. He wasn't speaking. He didn't need to. His posture said what needed to be said, which was, I am here. I have been in worse places than this. And I am not afraid. Several passengers were watching him. They were drawing something from what they saw. This was how it worked. In cabins. In emergencies. In any confined space where fear was available, and spreading you found the person whose body told the story you needed. And you watched them, and you borrowed what they had. Nathan Caldwell was watching Paul Hennessy. He was doing it without being aware he was doing it. His eyes had found the retired firefighter the way a compass finds north, not by decision, but by nature. Sandra Whitmore was watching Nathan watch Paul Hennessy. And she thought about the way people show you who they actually are when they're stripped of the resources they usually use to show you who they want you to think they are. She thought Nathan Caldwell, without his money and his watch and his sport coat and his certainty, was someone she probably could have had a decent conversation with. She thought that was interesting and also very sad. Doug Pierce was sitting with his phone in his bag and his hands folded in his lap and his eyes straight ahead. And he was making a list in his head, not a literal list. A list that existed in the register of the self that doesn't lie. The register that surfaces in airplanes and hospital rooms, in the middle of the night, a list of the things he wanted to change. It was a short list, short but specific. The specificity was what made it real. He was going to delete the videos when he landed. He was going to call his mother tonight. He was going to figure out why he had filmed that man in the first place. What the filming was for. What need it served. What it said about him that he had done it and then posted it. And he was going to sit with the answer to that question without letting himself off the hook. These were not dramatic resolutions. They were not cinematic. They were the small, specific, Ease. Honest decisions that people make when they are looking at themselves clearly. Ease. And they were the only kind of decision that had a chance of surviving contact with a normal Tuesday. Ease. Carla Jenkins had her eyes closed. She was not praying. Ease. Exactly. She was doing something more personal than prayer and less formal as sustained. Ease. Focused sending of herself toward her daughter, the way you can sometimes feel a person thinking about you across a distance. Ease. The way some people believe that concentrated love had mass and velocity and could travel. Ease. Grace was expecting her mother at 3 o'clock this afternoon. Ease. Carla was going to be there. She was going to walk through Grace's door and she was going to say the things, ease, in the order she had decided, and she was not going to lead with practicalities or weather or how was your week. Ease. She was going to lead with the truth. 18 miles, Ryan called. Ease. Gear down, Garrett said. Ryan reached for the gear lever. Ease. The aircraft shuddered as 300 pounds of landing gear dropped into the airstream. Ease. And the drag increased, and the nose wanted to pitch, and Garrett corrected it before it completed the pitch. Ease. And the airspeed began to drop exactly as calculated. Ease. And the right hydraulic system held at 21%, ease, and the left held at 14. Gear down and locked, Ryan confirmed. He's scanning the indicators. 3 green. Confirm 3 green, 3 green. Garrett exhaled once. Ease. One deliberate, controlled breath. Not relief, not yet, but the recognition that the gear was down and locked, and one more item on the list was behind them. Ease. Flaps 25, he said. Ryan moved the flap lever. Ease. The aircraft changed shape in the air, the flaps extending into the slipstream and generating lift and drag in the precise balance that the approach required. Ease. And Garrett felt the change in the controls immediately. Ease. The heavier feel that full flap configuration produced. Ease. And he adjusted continuously the way the situation required. Flaps 25, Ryan confirmed. Spoiler's left side is at 38% response. I feel it. He did. Ease. The aircraft wanted to roll slightly left, gently. Ease. Persistently. The asymmetric lift differential, making itself known through the control column. Ease. He was holding it straight with deliberate right aileron input that would have been automatic on a fully functional aircraft and was now a constant conscious act. Ease. I have it. 12 miles. In the cabin, Emily Parker had left Gerald Watkins at 9 miles. Ease. His color was better. His breathing was better. His grip on the armrest was noticeably looser. Ease. He had told her about Rosie's theory regarding dogs and opinions. Ease. And he had told her about David's wife, whose name was Kim and who made, ease, apparently, the best kimchi jjigae in the Pacific Northwest by Gerald's personal assessment. Ease. And by the time Emily stood to go, he had managed to look at her with something that was not quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. Ease. You're going to meet Rosie today, Emily said. He nodded. Ease. His eyes were bright. She moved to the front of the cabin. Ease. Paul Hennessy caught her eye. She gave him a single nod. Ease. He returned to his seat. She picked up the interphone. Ease. Garrett. Emily. The cabin is ready. A pause. Ease. She heard the background noise of the cockpit wind noise. Ease. Instrument tones. The specific acoustic signature of an aircraft working harder than it was designed to. Ease. Brace positions at 2 miles. He said, your call, I'll do it at 2. Tell them, he paused. Ease. Tell them we have the aircraft. She put down the interphone. Ease. She turned to the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, ease. And her voice was exactly what it needed to be. We are approximately 10 minutes from landing. Ease. In a few minutes, I'm going to ask you to assume the brace position. Ease. This is standard emergency procedure, and our crew is trained for it. Ease. I want to tell you one thing before I do. She looked at them. Ease. All of them. Row by row. The man at the controls of this aircraft has flown through things that would end most stories. Ease. He has brought people home who didn't expect to get there. Ease. He is doing that right now for you and for all of us. She paused. Ease. Assume the brace position when I give the instruction. Ease. Hold it. And trust the man in the cockpit. The silence after this was complete. Ease. Nathan Caldwell looked at the seat back in front of him and thought about Harper's soccer game. Ease. And the calendar he hadn't checked. And whether 9-year-old girls kept score of these things the way he was afraid they did. Ease. They did. He knew they did. He would deal with that when he was on the ground. Ease. He would deal with it. 7 miles. Garrett could see the runway on the approach chart. Ease. He could feel the geometry of it in the way a pilot feels the geometry of a landing, not visually yet. Ease, not from this altitude. Ease, but in the numbers. Ease in the rates. Ease in the architecture of angles and speeds and distances that had been building since Phoenix and that were now converging toward a single point on the Earth's surface at a rate that was exactly correct and had ease to stay exactly correct for the next 4 minutes. Ease. 4 minutes. The right hydraulic system dropped to 19%. Ease. Right system, Ryan said. It's accelerating. I see it, Ryan, 19%. The number lived in his hands. Ease. He could feel 19% in the resistance of the controls and in the extra effort the trim required, and in the aileron input he was maintaining to hold the wings level against the asymmetric lift from ease. The left spoilers at 38% authority. Ease. He was flying the aircraft. The aircraft was not flying itself. Ease. That was the correct relationship for this moment. Ease. Every input was his. Every correction was deliberate. Nothing was automatic. 5 miles, Ryan said. Airspeed, 147. Ease. 3 above ref. Good. Call me at 2 above and I'll adjust. Understood. The wind was doing its 12-knot gusting to 18 thing. Ease. And Garrett was accounting for it, building in the correction before the gust arrived, because he could feel the gusts coming in the subtle pitch changes that preceded them. Ease. The aircraft's nose lifting fractionally as the headwind component increased. Ease. And he was ready each time, already moving, already inside the response, before the response was technically required. 3 miles. Emily Parker stood at the front of the cabin. Ease. Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, please assume the brace position. Ease. Lean forward, head down, hands over your head or grasping your ankles. Ease. Please do so now. The cabin moved. 112 people bent forward in their seats. Ease. And the sound of that collective movement, the rustle of clothing, ease. The exhalation of breath held and then released into the position was one of the most human sounds Emily Parker had ever heard. Ease. The sound of people choosing to do what they were asked to do. Ease. The sound of trust. Nathan Caldwell leaned forward. Ease. He thought about Harper. Sandra Whitmore leaned forward with her mother's rosary beads still in her hand. Ease. Doug Pierce leaned forward and was, without quite understanding why, ease, crying, which was something he hadn't done in approximately 7 years, and which he decided, he's in this position, bent over his knees 37 miles from the Seattle airport. Ease. He was not going to try to stop. Paul Hennessy leaned forward and closed his eyes and thought about his wife, Ease, who was at home in Tempe, who would be watching the news in about 40 minutes when this was on it. Ease. And he thought, Ease, sweetheart, Ease, it's okay. Ease, I'm going to call you the second I'm on the ground. Ease. Carla Jenkins leaned forward and finished the sending she had been doing for the last hour. Ease. She sent it all, everything she had, Grace's name, Ease. Grace's face, the things she was going to say, the moment she walked through that door. Ease. Gerald Watkins leaned forward and thought about Rosie and dogs and opinions. 2 miles, Ryan said, airspeed, 144. Ease, 1 above. Garrett made the adjustment. Half a knot of power. Ease, the precise minimum required to hold VREF +1. Ease. No more, because every extra knot of airspeed was stopping distance they would need, and the stopping distance was already calculated down to its margin. Ease. The runway environment appeared in his peripheral vision. Ease. He did not look at it directly. Not yet. He flew the instruments because flying the instruments was what kept the geometry correct. Ease. And the geometry was everything. 1 mile, Ryan said. Ease. His voice had the quality of a man who is watching something. He is not sure he is going to be watching the same way in a few minutes. Ease. Not fear. The compressed, focused attention of someone who understands the stakes and has reduced himself to his essential function. Ease, runway in sight, Garrett said. He looked up. There it was. Ease. He had looked at runways from final approach more times than he could count. Ease, from aircraft that were working correctly and aircraft that were not. Ease, in weather that cooperated and weather that didn't. Ease, in daylight and darkness and conditions that the relevant paperwork described as inadvisable. Ease. He had looked at runways from angles that weren't supposed to be survivable. Ease. This runway was straight. The approach was clean. The geometry was exactly what he had built it to be. Ease. The emergency vehicles were visible on both sides of the runway trucks. Ease. Foam equipment, personnel in protective gear, arranged with the efficient purposefulness of people who were ready, but hoping they wouldn't be needed. He hoped the same thing. He flew the aircraft down through the last 500 feet with his hands making continuous small adjustments: aileron, ease, elevator, rudder, ease, power, the four instruments of controlled flight being played simultaneously the way a musician plays a complex chord. Ease. All four strings under tension. All four held in the precise relationship that made the chord what it was supposed to be. Ease. The right hydraulic system was at 16%. Ease. It was going to hold. He knew it was going to hold because he knew what he was asking of it, and he was asking only what it had. Ease, and what it had was going to be exactly enough. 50 feet, Ryan said. Ease. Garrett brought the power back. The aircraft dropped the last 50 feet with the slightly heavier ease, more deliberate quality of a machine that was working at the boundary of its current capacity. Ease. And Garrett held the nose at exactly the angle that the flare required. Ease. And the mains touched the runway at 712 feet past the threshold. Ease. And the touchdown was firm and controlled and real. Ease. And the concrete of runway 16L was under them, and they were on the ground. Ease. He deployed the thrust reversers with both hands. He felt the braking through the rudder pedals, the accumulator pressure translating into deceleration. The aircraft slowing, the math he had done in his head proving itself correct in the most complete way math can prove itself, which is by happening. They were slowing. Ease. The runway was long, and they were slowing, and the aircraft was straight, and the right hydraulic system was at 15% and holding. And the spoilers were doing what they could, and the brakes were doing what they could, and all of it together was enough. Ease. The aircraft stopped. 840 feet of runway remaining. Ease. Ryan Mitchell let out a breath that he had been holding. Ease. Garrett was fairly certain, since approximately the Nevada border. Ease. Garrett took his hands off the controls. He looked at them for a moment. Ease. His hands. The same hands that had held flight controls in places that didn't exist on public maps. Ease. That had rewritten a letter 4 times, that were going to hand that letter to his daughter in a few hours. Ease. They were steady. They had always been steady. Ryan was already on the radio. Ease. The words "souls on board, all safe" went out over the Seattle-Tacoma frequency, and Garrett heard them land in the silence of the cockpit like something solid being set down after a very long time of being carried. Ease. All safe. 114, all of them. He put his hands in his lap. Ease. He looked at the runway ahead of them, the emergency vehicles now moving in organized patterns on both sides. Ease. The foam truck standing down because there was no fire. Ease. Because there didn't need to be foam, because the math had held, and the aircraft had held, and the man holding the aircraft had held. Ease. Ryan Mitchell turned and looked at him. He didn't say anything at first. Ease. He looked at him the way you look at a person when words are available, but the right ones haven't arrived yet, and the ones that have arrived feel insufficient. Ease. Then he said, "Thank you." Garrett looked back at him. "Good flying, Ryan," he said. Ryan shook his head slightly. Ease. "I did maybe 30% of that. You did exactly what the situation needed from you." Ease. "That's not 30%. That's everything." Ryan sat with that. Ease. And in the cabin, Emily Parker straightened from the brace position she had taken at the front of the aircraft. Ease. And she looked at the cabin full of people beginning to straighten. Ease. Beginning to look at each other, beginning to make the sounds that people make when the thing they were afraid was going to happen did not happen. A sound that started quiet and built. Ease. And built. Ease. And kept building into something that filled the aircraft from bulkhead to bulkhead with the specific acoustics of 112 people discovering simultaneously that they were alive and safe and going to make their phone calls after all. Ease. The applause started in row 7, 1 person, then 3. Ease. Then the whole cabin. Ease. Standing. Ease. Every person who could stand on their feet within 30 seconds of the aircraft rolling to a stop. Ease. Their hands coming together in the particular way that human hands come together when the body needs to express something the voice cannot yet manage loud. Ease. Sustained, unselfconscious. The kind of applause that has nothing to do with performance and everything to do with survival. Ease. Emily Parker stood at the front of the cabin and let it happen. She did not try to manage it or redirect it or shape it into something more orderly. Ease. She just stood there and let 112 people express what they needed to express. Ease. And she pressed her own hands together twice before stopping herself. Ease. Because her job was not finished and she needed her hands for other things. Ease. The cockpit door opened. Garrett Callahan stepped out. Ease. The applause, which had already been at the ceiling of what a confined aircraft cabin could contain, ease, somehow found another level. He stood in the forward galley and looked at the cabin, and he did not smile in the way someone smiles when they are pleased with themselves. Ease. He looked at the faces, row after row of them turned toward him. Ease. Hands together, eyes bright with the specific brightness that belongs to people who have just been returned to their lives, and something moved through his expression that was private and real and did not perform itself for anyone. He nodded once, that was all. One nod, acknowledging what had been. What was now, and the 114 separate futures that were going to continue because of the last 4 hours. Nathan Caldwell was standing in row 3. He was clapping with the same hands that had white-knuckled an armrest over Nevada. And his face was doing something that his face did not normally do in public, which was showing exactly what was happening inside it without any of the management he typically applied to his expressions. He was looking at Garrett Callahan with an openness that was visibly costing him something. Not because openness was wrong, but because it was unfamiliar. And unfamiliar things cost effort even when they're right. Garrett began to walk back towards seat 4B. He had to pass Nathan to get there. Nathan stepped into the aisle. For a moment they stood facing each other, the man in the Italian shoes and the Swiss watch, and the man in the leather vest with Hell's Angels across the back, and the entire cabin, without coordinating, went quiet. Nathan opened his mouth. Whatever he had prepared to say, it didn't come out first. What came out first was, "I have a daughter." Garrett looked at him. She's 9, Nathan said. Her name is Harper. I missed her soccer game last week because he stopped. He's reorganized. I told myself it was because of work. It wasn't because of work. It was because I didn't prioritize it. He held Garrett's gaze. I treated you the way I treated you this morning because I make judgments about people based on what they look like and what they have. And I've been doing it my whole life, and I've been wrong about it my whole life. And I have never been proven wrong about it as completely and as fast as I was proven wrong about it today. The cabin was absolutely silent. Nathan's voice was not steady. He was making it work anyway. You saved my life, he said. You saved all of our lives. And I spent the first hour of this flight trying to make you feel like you didn't belong here. He exhaled. I don't know how to, Nathan, Garrett said. Nathan stopped. Call Harper, Garrett said. The moment you're off this plane. Not when you get to baggage claim. Not when you get to your car. Right now on the jetway. Call her. Nathan stared at him. Tell her you're coming to the next game, Garrett said. And then go. Nathan's jaw worked for a moment. His eyes were doing something he clearly had not expected them to do in public. He pressed his lips together and nodded, a single definitive nod. The nod of a man making a commitment that he intends to keep. And then he stepped back and let Garrett pass. Sandra Whitmore, still in her seat, watched this and thought about her boys, 18 and 20. Both of them under the impression that their mother was a very busy woman with very important commitments. Both of them correct about the busy and the commitments and missing the thing underneath. Which was that she had taught herself to be busy the way some people teach themselves to be numb. And the altitude had stripped that lesson away for about 90 minutes, and she wasn't sure she wanted to relearn it. She decided, quietly and completely, that she didn't. She was going to call them tonight, both of them. Not on a schedule. Just because. Doug Pierce was the third person off the aircraft when the door finally opened. Which surprised him because he was normally the person who let other people go first so he could be last. Could document the deplaning, could find the angle. He moved through the jetway with his bag in his hand and his phone still in his bag. And the first thing he did when he reached the terminal was find a corner and sit down and open his social media accounts. He deleted both videos. He did not post an explanation. He did not post an apology for the benefit of his followers. He did not turn the deletion itself into content. He just deleted them. Then he texted his mother, "Hey mom in Seattle. Please. I know this is random, but I want to come see you. Can I come to Spokane this weekend? Please." Her response came in 40 seconds. It was 3 exclamation points and a heart. And then, "Of course, I'll make the soup." He sat with that for a moment. Then he put his phone away and went to find the baggage claim. In the jetway, Paul Hennessy was on his phone. "Margie," he said, when she picked up. "Yeah, it's me. I know you're going to see it on the news." "I'm fine. I'm walking off the plane right now." A pause. He stopped walking. People moved around him. "Margie, I just wanted to say," his voice caught on something. He waited for it to pass. "I just wanted to say that I am the luckiest man I know. That's all. I just wanted to make sure you knew that." Another pause. "I know you know, I know. I just wanted to say it out loud." He listened to whatever she said. He smiled the smile of a man who has been loved well for a long time and knows it. "I'll be home tonight," he said. "I'll tell you everything. Start with the retired firefighter in 3C, because that's me. And I'm going to enjoy telling this one." He laughed. "Yeah, see you tonight, sweetheart." He hung up. He resumed walking. He was already composing the story in his head, the shape of it. The details he'd include, the moment he'd end on, because 30 years of emergency work had taught him that the way you told the story afterward was how you carried it. And he intended to carry this one well. Carla Jenkins was the last passenger off the aircraft. Not because she was slow, because she stopped in the galley and waited for Emily Parker, who was doing the final cabin check that regulations required and that Emily would have done regardless of regulation, because it was her aircraft and her responsibility until the last person was off it and the door was closed behind her. Emily finished her check and came forward and found Carla standing there. "I wanted to say thank you," Carla said. Emily shook her head. "That belongs in the cockpit." "Some of it," Carla said. "Some of it belongs here, what you said to us, the way you talked to us. It wasn't a speech. It was a person talking to people. That's rarer than you think it is." Emily looked at her. The exhaustion of the last 4 hours was visible now. In the slight change around her eyes, in the quality of her stillness, the stillness of someone who has been extremely activated for a sustained period and whose body is beginning to understand that the activation is over. "Thank you," Emily said, and meant it. "How long have you been doing this?" Carla asked. 12 years, does it always?" She stopped. Started again. "Is every flight this?" "No," Emily said. "Most of them are nothing. And then some of them are everything." She paused. "That's kind of how it works." Carla nodded. She understood this. 32 years of teaching had the same architecture. "I hope the next 100 are nothing," Carla said. Emily almost smiled. "Me too." Carla walked off the aircraft. Emily Parker stood alone in the cabin for exactly 12 seconds. She counted them. Without knowing she was counting, and then she went back to her galley and sat down in the jump seat and put her face in her hands. Not crying, not yet. Just being for 12 seconds. A person who had just been through something and needed to be a person for a moment before being anything else. Then she straightened. She took out her phone. She dialed Portland. Marcus Parker answered on the second ring with the cheerful bluster of a man who was in the middle of something mechanical and was happy to be interrupted by his sister. "Hey, what's up?" "I'm elbow deep in a transmission, Marcus," Emily said. The tone stopped him. He knew her voice in all its registers. He had known it for 38 years. "What happened?" "Are you okay?" "I'm okay," she said. "I'm fine. We're on the ground." Her voice moved in a direction she hadn't intended. She let it go. "I met someone today. A pirate Callahan." Silence on the other end that had a very specific quality. "He remembers you," Emily said. "I told him your name and he said he remembered you and that you were a good man." Marcus Parker, who had survived multiple deployments and currently ran a garage in Portland and had not cried in what he would have described as a professionally appropriate length of time, made a sound that was not entirely composed. He said. "I know," she said. "He was the best I ever saw," Marcus said. "I mean that. I've seen a lot of pilots. He was different. He flew like the aircraft was an extension of himself. like there was no separation. I know, she said again. I saw it today, a long pause. Is everyone okay? Marcus asked. Everyone's okay. All of them? All of them. Another long pause. Of course they are, Marcus said, with a conviction that was not bravado, but something much older and more earned. Of course they are. She stayed on the phone with her brother for 11 more minutes. And when she hung up, she felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled since 6:47 that morning. And she picked up her bag and walked off the aircraft and into the terminal. On the other side of the building, in the secure area near the operations office, Garrett Callahan was sitting in a chair that someone had pulled out for him. Drinking the coffee that someone else had put in his hand. Answering the questions of an FAA representative named Denise Hartwell, who had arrived with a recorder and a legal pad, and the particular careful but urgent demeanor of a regulator who understands that the situation requires both documentation and discretion. He answered every question directly and completely. He did not minimize or embellish. He gave her the technical facts in the sequence they had occurred. And when she asked for his assessment of First Officer Ryan Mitchell's performance, he said without hesitation, outstanding. Under conditions that would have compromised a less capable pilot, he maintained his discipline and his judgment. The outcome belongs to both of us, but his performance belongs entirely to him. Denise wrote this down. Ryan Mitchell, sitting 2 chairs away with his own coffee and his own legal pad, heard this and looked at the floor. And the thing that happened in his face was the thing that happens when someone who has been working hard at something for a long time is told, by someone whose assessment carries weight, that the work has produced what it was supposed to produce. He had gone into aviation at 22 with the specific intention of becoming the kind of pilot that other pilots trusted. He was 34 now. He had 12 years of work in the bank. And today he had found out whether the bank held what he thought it held. It held. The FAA representative moved through her questions for 40 minutes. And at the end she looked at Garrett over the top of her legal pad and said, I want to be clear that what you did today is going to require a review process. There are protocols about cockpit access, I understand, Garrett said. The review is standard and it's not punitive, but it will happen. I know. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, somewhat outside her regulatory role but completely within her human one, the preliminary data from the aircraft systems shows that the right hydraulic system reached 11% before touchdown. At 8%, manual reversion control forces on that aircraft exceed the structural limits of what most pilots can maintain at approach speed. She paused. Most pilots. Garrett looked at her. The review will take the time it takes, she said. But I want you to know right now that what you did today will be in the training materials. She said this last thing in a voice that was entirely matter of fact, the way she might note a regulatory compliance date. But the weight of it was not regulatory. Garrett nodded once. She closed her legal pad. Outside the operations office, the terminal had developed the quality that follows news that gathered, murmuring, phone-in-hand quality of a public space where something significant has just happened and the information is propagating in real time. Several news crews had set up near the arrivals area. A spokesperson from the airline was giving a statement that Garrett could see through the glass but couldn't hear. He didn't particularly want to hear it. He wanted to get his bag and get to Lillian. Ryan Mitchell stood and extended his hand. Garrett stood and took it. They shook hands with the grip of 2 people who have been in close quarters during something that required complete mutual trust. And who came out the other side with that trust intact, which is a kind of bond that doesn't require much additional language. I owe you a drink, Ryan said. You don't owe me anything. I know I don't. Garrett considered this. Coffee, he said. When this is all done, I'll take coffee. Ryan almost smiled. Coffee it is. The operations door opened. The airline's head of security, a woman named Patricia Lyons, stepped in and said they had a car waiting to take Garrett wherever he needed to go, and that the airline's CEO was on the phone and wanted to speak with him, and that there were approximately 14 media requests waiting in his name at the front desk. Garrett looked at her. I don't need a car, he said. I'll take a cab. I don't need to speak with the CEO. If he wants to do something useful, he can make sure Captain Briggs's family has everything they need. And the media can have whatever statement your communications department wants to give them. Patricia Lyons looked at him for a moment. He's recalibrating several assumptions. That's it, she said. That's it, he said. Can I get my bag? His bag was brought to him. He walked through the terminal. People looked at him. Some of them were passengers from Flight 719 who recognized him and who did the thing that people do when they want to acknowledge something they don't have adequate words for: a nod. A hand raised, a look that carried more than a look usually carries. He acknowledged each of the small nod he had given the cabin. The nod that said, I know. We were there together. We're here now. One of the last people he passed was Gerald Watkins. Gerald was sitting in a chair near the arrival's exit. Phone pressed to his ear, face animated in a way that bore no resemblance to the face of the man gripping an armrest in row 11:40 minutes ago. He was saying, he's into the phone, with a particular emphasis of a grandfather who is making plans. David, I don't care about the dinner reservation. Tell Kim we'll eat at the house. I want to meet Rosie. Right now. Tell her grandpa's coming and he looked around. I'm bringing something. I'll find something in the airport. They always have something. He looked up and saw Garrett passing, and his voice went quiet for a second. He took the phone from his ear. Hey, he said. Garrett stopped. I don't know your name, Gerald said. Garrett. Gerald, he extended his hand and Garrett shook it. I'm going to meet my granddaughter today, Rosie. She's 4. I haven't met her in person yet. He paused. I wouldn't be going if it weren't for you. Garrett looked at him for a moment. Rosie sounds like she knows what she's talking about. About dogs and opinions. Gerald blinked. Then he laughed a real laugh. Full-bodied, the laugh of a man who had not expected to laugh again quite this soon and was grateful for the surprise of it. Emily told you. Emily tells me what I need to know. Gerald shook his head. Still smiling. Go see whoever you're going to see, he said. Go see them right now. Garrett nodded. He walked to the exit. The late afternoon light hit him when the doors opened. And he stood for a moment in it, feeling it on his face. The particular quality of Seattle afternoon light that was different from Phoenix light, softer. More diffuse, filtered through the marine air in a way that made everything slightly more luminous and slightly less certain at the edges. He reached into his jacket pocket. The letter was there. He didn't take it out. He just confirmed it was there. The way a person confirms the presence of something important before they go somewhere that requires them to have it. He took out his phone and called Lillian. She answered on the third ring. Her voice carrying the background noise of a medical clinic mid-afternoon voices. A door, the particular controlled busyness of a place doing necessary work. Dad, are you here already? I thought your flight wasn't. I landed a little early, he said. How was the flight? He thought about how to answer this. Educational, he said. She laughed. That sounds ominous. You okay? I'm very okay. He paused. Leah, I'm proud of you. He said it first. The way he decided he would say it. First, before everything else. Before logistics and plans and the letter he was going to hand her. What you've built up there, the clinic, what you did with that neighborhood. I don't have the right word for what I am when I think about it. But it's the biggest version of proud. A silence on her end. Then, Dad, I have a letter, he said. I want to give it to you in person. It says the rest, but I wanted to say that part out loud first, before I got there, because I wasn't going to wait anymore. Another silence. When Lillian spoke again, her voice had changed in the way that voices change when a person has been holding something carefully for a long time, and someone they love just gave them permission to put it down. How far away are you? She said, I'm outside the terminal. 20 minutes maybe. I'm closing the clinic early, she said. You don't have to, Dad. Her voice was steady and warm and entirely certain. I'm closing the clinic early. Come straight here. He stood outside the terminal with the phone in his hand after she hung up. And he breathed the Seattle air, and he thought about 20 minutes. which was a very short distance from where he was standing to where he needed to be. He raised his hand for a cab. The cab came. He got in. The driver, a man in his 50s who had the radio on low, glanced at the leather vest in the rearview mirror without comment and asked where he was going. Garrett gave the address. The driver pulled out into the airport traffic. They rode in comfortable silence for a few minutes. And then the driver said, not looking back. Just talking to the windshield and the traffic. You were on that flight, weren't you? The 719. Garrett looked at the back of his head. Yeah, I had the radio on. They said a passenger helped land it. The first officer landed it, Garrett said. I assisted. The driver nodded slowly. My wife flew last month. She called me after and said, you know what? She said. Every time she flies, she thinks about the people on the plane and how she doesn't know any of them, and she doesn't know what any of them have been through, and that's kind of beautiful and kind of terrifying at the same time. He paused. She's a nurse. She thinks like that. Garrett looked out the window. She's right, he said. The cab moved through the streets of Seattle. And the city moved around them, ordinary and vast and indifferent, in the way that cities are always indifferent to the specific weight of what's happening inside the vehicles passing through them. Inside the people, inside the vehicles, inside the pockets of those people where letters were folded and waiting and already doing the work they had been written to do. 17 minutes later, the cab pulled up in front of a small clinic in a neighborhood that had the particular character of a place that knew its own value without needing anyone else to confirm it. The sign above the door read Callahan Community Clinic in clean dark letters. And through the front window, Garrett could see the waiting room that Lillian had painted herself. And the chairs, and the particular quality of a space that has been built with genuine care for the people who will use it. He paid the driver. He got out. He stood on the sidewalk and looked at his daughter's name on that sign and felt ease in the most straightforward and uncomplicated way. Something that his military training had no category for, and his 20 years of flight experience had no analog to. The door opened. Lillian Callahan was 31 years old, and she had her mother's eyes and her father's jaw and a white medical coat over a blue shirt. And she was standing in the doorway of the clinic she had built in the neighborhood that needed it. And she was looking at her father, standing on the sidewalk with his leather vest and his silver blonde hair, and the expression on his face that she had not seen before and that she understood immediately. Dad, she said. Hey, kid, he said. She crossed the sidewalk and hugged him. And he put both arms around her with the completeness of a man who had spent too long holding back and was done holding back. And they stood there, on the sidewalk in front of her sign in the Seattle afternoon light. And whatever the years had put between them, they put it down. He reached into his pocket. He took out the letter. He held it out to her. She took it with one hand and kept the other on his arm. And she looked at it, the handwriting, the folded page, the care visible in the paper itself, and she said, quietly, fourth draft? He looked at her. How did you? Because you always get there on the she said. You always think you get it right on the third, but you don't. You get it right on the fourth. He stared at her. She smiled, her mother's smile. Come inside, she said. I want you to meet Deb. He followed his daughter into the clinic she had built. And the door closed behind him, and the sign with her name on it caught the last of the afternoon light and held it for a moment before the cloud moved, and the light changed, and the street returned to its ordinary Tuesday character. Indifferent and alive and continuous, the way streets always are. Across the city, Emily Parker was sitting in a quiet corner of a bar near her layover hotel, talking to her brother Marcus on the phone for the third time in 4 hours. The two of them rebuilding the architecture of a closeness that had existed before deployment and distance and the natural drift of adult lives had done what adult lives do. Ryan Mitchell was in the airline's operations office, finishing the last of his paperwork, and when he signed his name at the bottom of the incident report, he held the pen still for a moment afterward and thought about the number 11%, and about what it meant to be the kind of pilot who could hold 11% together. Ease. And he decided, with the quiet certainty of a man who has just found the boundary of his capability and discovered it is further out than he thought, ease, that he was going to spend the rest of his career finding out exactly how far it went. Ease. Gerald Watkins was in the back of his son's car, holding a stuffed animal he had purchased in the airport gift shop, a small gray dog. Ease. Selected because Rosie had opinions about dogs and because some gifts need to mean something, and listening to his son, David, talk about the drive from the airport. Ease. The traffic. Ease. The neighborhood. Ease. The restaurant that had opened down the street that David wanted to try. Ease. And Gerald listened to all of it with the full, grateful ease, unpartitioned attention of a man who understands that ordinary conversation is a gift that requires being alive to receive. Ease. Nathan Caldwell had called Harper from the jetway. Ease. She had answered with the particular cautious brightness of a 9-year-old who had learned that her father's calls sometimes meant, "I can't make it, sweetheart, but he loves her." He had said, before she could say anything after hello, ease. "Harper, I'm coming to your next game. I don't care what's on my calendar." Ease. "I'm coming." A silence then. "Promise?" "Promise." Another silence. Ease. Then, in the voice of a 9-year-old making the calculation of how much to believe, ease. "Okay, Dad." He was going to be there. He was going to be there because at 37,000 feet above the ground, ease, with his hands white on an armrest, the ledger of his life had presented itself to him in a clarity that comfort and money and status normally insulate a person from. And what the ledger showed was very simple and very clear and required no interpretation. He was going to be there. Paul Hennessy made it home to Temp by 9 that evening. Walked through his front door and found his wife Margie at the kitchen table with the television on and a cup of tea going cold beside her, and the expression of a woman who has been holding herself together by intention rather than ease. She stood when she saw him. He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps. They held each other in the kitchen for a long time. Not speaking, because there was nothing that needed saying that wasn't already being said by the fact of them standing there. In their kitchen, on a Tuesday night, alive and together, and in possession of all the ordinary time that stretched ahead of them. That was the whole story. Not the hydraulics, not the manual reversion. Not the final approach at 11% with the runway at 16 miles and the math holding by its margins. This was the story. He's a man on a Tuesday. He's going to see his daughter. Carrying a letter in his pocket, who happened to know how to do the thing that needed doing when the thing that needed doing was exactly the thing that could not be left undone. A man whose name people hadn't known when they mocked him. A man whose record they couldn't read because they were too busy reading his vest. A man who did not need their approval to know who he was. And who extended them the grace of his competence anyway. Not because they had earned it, but because the people on that aircraft had lives to return to. And getting them back to those lives was the only thing that mattered. And doing what needed to be done was the only identity Garrett Callahan had ever required. The leather vest did not make him dangerous. The leather vest did not make him less. The leather vest was just what a man wore on a Tuesday when he was going to see his daughter. And the medals in a box in his closet in Phoenix were just metal. And the patches on the front of the vest were just cloth. And underneath all of it was the only thing that had ever been true about him, which was this: when the moment required everything he had everything it required. That is what a life of service looks like from the inside. That is what it looks like from the outside too, if you know how to see it. And sometimes it takes 37,000 feet and a hydraulic failure and 4 minutes of runway to teach a person how to see it. But once you learn, you do not forget. You do not get to forget. Because the person you almost dismissed without a second thought might be the only person standing between you and a runway you never reach. And the world does not organize itself according to your assumptions about who matters and who doesn't. It organizes itself on the days that count around who shows up. Garrett Callahan always showed up. That was who he was. That was who he had always been.